Some chains make no noise, but they destroy from within. It was on a dry, dusty afternoon in rural Texas that I saw something I've never forgotten. The wind blew hot, carrying the smell of burnt straw and old sweat, when the sound of shackles dragging on the ground echoed through the main square. A girl, as fragile as a leaf in the wind, was being pulled by her own father, a disheveled man intoxicated by alcohol. She must have been about 15, but her eyes held a pain only those who have lost everything can know. I was sitting on the porch of my ranch, watching the hustle and bustle of the village, when that grotesque scene interrupted the monotonous routine. The father shouted incoherent words, his voice hoarse and filled with rage, while the girl stumbled, her ankles bound by rusty chains. The hard ground hurt her bare feet, leaving marks that no amount of time could erase. With each step, she seemed to die a little more inside, and I, a mere observer until then, felt something break inside me. It was then that I realized this wasn't just an isolated act of cruelty. It was a reflection of a world that turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. No one moved. People pretended not to see, but I saw. I heard the sound of steel striking stone, the sob caught in her throat, and the smell of fear permeating the air. It wasn't just her body that was chained, it was her soul. Share this story. To reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. But to understand how it all came to this, I need to tell you about the night that changed everything. It was a night so dark that even the stars seemed to have hidden in shame. And that's where our story truly begins, in the bitter cold of darkness, where every sigh is an unanswered cry for help. That night, before the auction, the girl, named Elsie, was locked in the barn. Her father, a man consumed by cheap whiskey and unpayable debts, had decided that his own daughter would be the price to clear his name among the local merchants. Fear was so thick inside that barn that it felt like an invisible, suffocating smoke. Elsie, leaning against a rotting wooden wall, tried futilely to untie the knots in the ropes that bound her. The smell of rotting hay and sweat permeated the air. She remembered her mother, who had never returned after a particularly cruel winter. She didn't make it, her father had said, emotionless. Since then, Elsie had learned to survive on scraps and hide from her father's red eyes in the late afternoons. But that night was different. She knew something worse was coming. She felt the weight of a fate she hadn't chosen on her back, and the silence of the world was a deafening scream. When her father entered the barn, his eyes bloodshot and his breath poisonous, he carried an old pair of chains. Without a word, he began to chain her as if she were an animal ready for slaughter. His calloused hands squeezed tightly, and with each pull, a part of her hope crumbled. "At least you'll be good for something tomorrow," he spat, before leaving her there alone in the dark. The moon outside was the only witness to the muffled cries of a girl who didn't know if she would ever see the sun again. The early morning chill bit into Elsie's bones, but nothing hurt more than abandonment. Through her sobs, she repeated in her mind, "I will not bow, I will not bow," but it became increasingly difficult to believe. It seemed the world had decided she was worthless, unworthy of saving. And there, on that hard floor, she slept fitfully, unaware that her fate was about to cross with a silent man with an iron gaze and a hidden heart. At dawn, the village would begin to stir for the dirtiest auction ever held in those parts. Soulless men with hungry eyes were already preparing to choose their next acquired possession. But no one expected that morning fate would blow a different wind, coming from the dry lands beyond the horizon. And it was precisely this wind that carried a name: Caleb, the silent farmer. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, and already it seemed as if hell had descended upon the dusty village. Heat was beginning to creep into the sky, but inside Elsie, everything was cold, a freezing void that no flame could warm. Her father appeared in the barn with a crooked smile, holding a whip that seemed more like a silent warning: "Don't try to resist." With a brutal yank, he dragged her across the dry, rough earth, the chains weighing on her ankles, as if each link were a sentence. A reminder that she was nothing more than property. Each step to the auction square was a punishment for simply existing. She heard the laughter of the gathered men, the dirty comments, and felt the gaze of the women who, even in silence, condemned her out of fear or habit. It was a parade of shame, a funeral procession of her own dignity. The ground burned, but not as much as her father's own gaze. There was no longer any trace of affection or memory of having once been a daughter. To him, Elsie was just a dead weight needing to earn some money. With each stumble, he pulled harder on the chain, and dust seeped into the open wounds on her ankles. The blood dripped slowly, mingling with the earth, as if the ground wanted to keep some of that pain for itself. The church bells tolled in the distance, but they weren't a call to faith. They sounded like an early funeral. Elsie, head bowed, repeated the words only she could hear. "I will not bow. I will not bow." But her tired body almost betrayed her. Her wobbly legs threatened to give way, and pride was only a thin thread keeping her standing. Arriving at the square, her father lifted Elsie by her hair, displaying her like a cursed trophy, a piece of marketable meat. The men approached, scrutinizing with dry eyes, weighing what they could gain from this broken child. "She's a hard worker, resilient. She doesn't cry for nothing," he shouted, trying to mask his own failure with false propaganda. Elsie wanted to disappear, to bury herself underground, dissolve into the dust and never return. But she remained there, breathing heavily, tasting rust and humiliation in her mouth. The smell of sweat, alcohol and mud permeated everything, a mixture that seemed to have permeated even the sky, which at that moment seemed closer to the earth. As the betting began, each word was a silent shot that pierced what little hope remained within her. There was laughter, whispers, and even bets made with bottles of whiskey instead of money. There was no law to protect a child in that forgotten land, only the desires of the most rotten men. And it was there, amidst that human filth, that something changed. A sudden silence fell over the square as a lone figure crossed the space. His steps slow but steady, like the sound of a war drum. The ground seemed to tremble, not from his strength, but from his presence. Everyone fell silent. I, watching from the edge, knew in that instant destiny had just arrived. His name was Caleb. Caleb was a man few dared to look at for long. Tall, his skin was scarred by the Texas sun, and his eyes were a cold gray that seemed to cut through anyone who stared too long. His calloused hands betrayed decades of hard work, but they also hid a restrained strength, a kind of power that didn't need proving. Everyone simply knew it. He didn't speak much, rarely. His wide hat shadowed his eyes, making it impossible to decipher what he was thinking. He lived on a remote farm, surrounded by dry land and broken fences, but it was said that no injustice escaped his notice. And there, Caleb was, staring at the degrading spectacle of that auction. The men took a step back without even realizing it. There was something about Caleb that stirred their tainted conscience, as if the farmer's mere presence were a mirror, revealing their own rottenness. Elsie's father, his breath still thick with alcohol, tried to maintain his composure but stammered. "Are you going to buy something or just come to look, farmer?" he teased, lacking any real courage. Caleb didn't respond immediately. He simply moved closer to Elsie, who couldn't even lift her head. His silence spoke louder than any threat. With each step he took, the ground seemed to creak, as if the earth itself were on alert. Then, Caleb stood before her. Dust billowed around them, the wind carrying particles that glittered in the bright sun, as if time had stopped to hear what this man had to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but so firm it echoed like thunder. "She will never bow again." It wasn't a request, it wasn't a warning, it was a sentence, as if the earth itself had decided to protect Elsie. The silence that followed was so heavy that no one dared breathe aloud. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if something sacred was happening before our eyes. Elsie's father tried to laugh, a weak laugh, but it died in his throat when Caleb leaned over and broke the chains with his bare hands, using a small iron tool from his belt. The sound of the metal breaking rang like bells of freedom for anyone who still felt something good there. Elsie, confused and weak, fell to her knees, but Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. "Get up, girl. You weren't born for this," he said, his tone brooking no denial. For the first time, someone looked at her without pity, but with respect. It made her cry, not with pain, but with relief. The entire village watched, unsure how to react. Justice didn't come from courts in that land, but from men who decided what was right. And Caleb was the silent justice everyone feared. As he picked up Elsie, he looked back at her father and added, "You've already lost what was most precious to you. Now she's no longer yours." And then, without looking back, he began walking, taking Elsie with him, leaving behind a trail of silence and shame that no one would ever be able to erase from that village. The dirt road leading to Caleb's farm was long and silent, lined with dry fields, wind-twisted trees, and the distant wail of coyotes. With each step of the horse, Elsie felt her body sway, still bruised, still broken, but enveloped by an unfamiliar warmth, security. Caleb didn't say a word the entire way. The only thing she heard was the sound of the harness leather and the steady rhythm of his hooves on the ground. Yet she wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. Every time she looked up at the starry sky, she tried to understand what had happened. How could a man who didn't even know her face, everyone for her? It was a mystery as great as the universe itself, shining above them. When they reached the farm, a vast but simple property surrounded by weathered wooden fences, Caleb dismounted and swept her into his arms as if she were light as a feather. The scent of earth, hay, and old leather mingled with the soft scent of jasmine growing in a corner of the neglected garden. He led her to a small but clean room with a makeshift bed and rough but warm blankets. Without saying much, he simply handed her a mug of water and a piece of bread. "Here, you don't need to bow," he repeated before leaving, gently closing the door behind him. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken promises, with respect, with care. Elsie struggled to sleep that first night. The chains were no longer on her ankles, but she still felt their weight in her memory, in her body, in her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father, heard his screams, felt the cold floor of the auction square. But then, remembering Caleb's gaze, steady as a rock, something inside her began to shift. She repeated to herself like a mantra, "I no longer need to bow," and she wept silently, hot tears that washed her soul, even though her heart was still in ruins. The next morning, the sun streamed through the cracks in the wooden window, bringing the smell of fresh coffee and bread baking in the kitchen. Caleb was already up, working in the corral as if nothing had changed. Elsie watched through the window, still suspicious that it was all a dream, but it wasn't. Here, no one called her property, no one looked at her with contempt or desire. There was only work, land, and the sound of birds struggling to survive in the merciless Texas heat. For the first time, she wanted to get out of bed, wanted to experience what it was like to live without fear. When she finally summoned the courage to leave, she was greeted by a discreet nod from Caleb. "There's a whole world out there that owes you nothing, but it won't hold you back either. It's up to you to learn to walk again," he said. His every word was an anchor, keeping her grounded in the present, preventing her from returning to the shadows of the past. And there, on that patch of dry ground under the immense sky, Caleb promised without needing to swear, she would never again be treated as lesser. Never again would she have to bow down to any man. Meanwhile, in the village, the morning after the auction was unlike any other. People woke not only with the weight of hangovers and dust, but with the bitter taste of shame. The news that Caleb had taken the girl without paying a cent spread faster than the wind through the dusty streets. No one dared to contest it. No one wanted to seek out the farmer in his distant land. Everyone knew that justice had been served there, even if silently. Elsie's father, meanwhile, woke up in the gutter, daughterless, penniless, and honorless. No man in the village helped him up, not even his drinking buddies. Contempt was his only companion now. Some whispered that Caleb was a dangerous man, meddling where he wasn't wanted. But deep down, everyone knew he had done the right thing. The women, especially, whispered about Caleb's steady gaze, about how he hadn't needed to shout or threaten to end the horror of that auction. A respect had emerged amidst the fear, a recognition that in this forgotten land, there was still someone willing to face anything to protect an innocent. And even if no one said it out loud, there was a relief, a collective sigh that something good could still blossom there. On the farm, Caleb treated each day as if nothing had changed. He worked the land, cared for the animals, and occasionally taught Elsie how to plant, how to feed the horses, how to understand the sky and the clouds. But he never forced her to do anything. "When you're ready, you'll know," he would say. And Elsie, who had previously known nothing of freedom, began to understand what it meant to walk of her own free will. She still stumbled, still cried in secret, still had nightmares. But each morning was a new beginning. Each sunrise was a chance to be a little freer. One morning, as the sun gilded the arid fields, Elsie finally lifted her head to the sky and took a deep breath. The smell of dry earth, coffee on the stove, and sweat from work was no longer a reminder of pain, but of life. Her legs felt firm, her arms stronger, her heart less heavy. She was no longer that girl in chains. She was a young woman, slowly learning to be her own woman. Caleb watched from afar, without invading her space, but always attentive, like someone tending a flower beginning to bloom after a harsh winter. And it was in this scene of silent reconstruction that Elsie heard for the first time the phrase Caleb always said to himself, unaware that she was listening, "As long as I'm alive, she will never bend again." It was more than a promise. It was an oath engraved in the very soil of the farm, in the trees that resisted the wind, and in the soul of a man who knew the weight of carrying invisible wounds. There, in that corner of the world, her freedom had a guardian. And nothing would be the same again. Time passed, and Elsie's transformation was as visible as the sky changing colors at dusk. Her physical scars had healed, but those of her soul still throbbed on silent nights. Even so, each dawn was a cry of resistance. She learned to cultivate the land, to care for the animals, to understand the value of sweat that comes not from pain, but from dignity. Caleb taught her silently, showing the way without pushing. Little by little, Elsie discovered she could be strong. She no longer needed chains to remind herself of who she was. Now, her firm, calloused hands were her new identity. With each seed planted, it was as if she buried a bit of that rotten past that nearly destroyed her. But life never allows peace to last long without being challenged. One cloudy morning, a group of village men appeared at the farm's edge. They were led by Elsie's own father, now dirtier, drunker, and more desperate than ever. He couldn't accept having been demoralized in front of everyone, and now he wanted his daughter back, not out of love or regret, but out of wounded pride and greed. Caleb met them alone at the gate, his eyes cold as steel, his hat low, his hands firm on his leather belt. There were no weapons, no shouting, just a man who carried in his gaze the weight of a world he had seen too much. Elsie's father shouted, raged, threatened. "She's mine! You can't take from me what's rightfully mine." The voice echoed across the field, thick with resentment and shame. Caleb didn't move. He just let silence fill the space between them until Elsie's father was speechless, suffocated by his own hatred. Then, in a low, gravelly tone, Caleb said, "She's no one's. Whoever touches her, touches me." The words fell like stones to the dry ground. The men hesitated. None of them wanted to challenge the one who had once faced the entire village without even raising his voice. Elsie, watching from afar, felt her heart race. Her body still felt the weight of the chains, but she was no longer that chained girl. She walked to the gate, her face held high, her eyes steady. She stopped beside Caleb and stared at her father. "I'm not coming back. I'm not yours. I never was," she said with a firmness that made the wind stop for an instant. That sentence was the final break, the ultimate liberation. Her father tried to advance, but Caleb stepped forward without aggression, just a presence so strong it seemed to erect an invisible wall between them. The group gave up. Elsie's father, defeated by his daughter's gaze and Caleb's silence, retreated. He staggered to his horse and disappeared into the dusty horizon like a ghost doomed to wander its own failure. Caleb then looked at Elsie and simply said, "Now yes, you are free." And she smiled, a shy smile, but filled with a power she never imagined she possessed. From that moment on, Caleb was not only the guardian of this land, she was too. Together, they had built a territory where no one would be chained anymore. Even with her father and the villagers gone, Elsie's wounds still needed healing. It wasn't enough to ward off physical danger. She needed to rescue her soul, which had been so often trampled upon and forgotten. And Caleb knew this. He wasn't a man of sweet words or easy promises, but his every gesture was a silent care, a way of saying, "You deserve to be alive." Little by little, he taught her to plant not just corn or wheat, but hope. The land that once seemed barren now flourished beneath her hands. Each seedling that grew was a part of Elsie reborn, a part of herself rediscovered as strong, capable, and alive. One afternoon, while tending to a broken fence together, Caleb finally shared a piece of himself. He told me that, as a young man, he too had lost everything: his family, his farm, his future. He had been deceived, betrayed, and cast aside by the world. Since then, he had vowed that if he could ever be buried alive, he would never again let anyone be buried alive as he had been. And there, on that land he had rebuilt with his own hands, Caleb found his mission: to save not only the land, but the souls lost along the way. "Every person I rescue is a part of me that I save too," he said, his gaze lost on the horizon. Elsie understood in that moment that her rescue was no accident. It was a meeting of souls marked by pain, but determined not to lose each other completely. She decided that she too would be the guardian of other stories, that she would never allow another girl to go through what she had. And so, Caleb's farm became a refuge, a patch of ground where the past had no power to chain anyone. Men, women, and children began to appear, all fleeing pain the world ignored, and Caleb and Elsie welcomed them with open arms, no questions asked, only with work, food, and respect. The village was still there, but now they looked at the farm with reverence and fear. They knew that there were lives the world had tried to destroy. They knew there was a strength measured not in weapons or money, but in character. And even Elsie's father, wandering aimlessly, knew he would never get back what he lost. He vanished like dust in the wind, a reminder that time does not forgive those who live by destroying others. And so, with each sunrise, Caleb and Elsie continued their silent work of rescue, not just of people, but of dignity, of souls, of hope. With each new face that arrived, a piece of them was rebuilt too. Because in the end, as Caleb always said, freedom is when you learn that no one else has the right to break you. And on that farm, everyone learned that, one day at a time. The years passed, and the farm became much more than a piece of land. It became a home for all who arrived broken by the world, a place where no one was judged for their past. Elsie, now a young woman with a firm gaze and calloused hands, was no longer just the saved girl. She was the savior of many. She walked the land confidently, led the work, taught the younger ones how to farm, how to care for the animals, but above all, how to hold their heads high. In every corner of the farm, the echo of Caleb's words lingered. "Here, no one bows." Caleb grew older, but he never lost the strength of his gaze. He would sit on the porch at dusk, observing what they had built together. Every smile, every child running through the fields was a silent victory against the world that once tried to crush them. And it was on those afternoons that Caleb would say to himself, "I didn't need pretty words. only firm actions. Elsie knew she had a true father in him, not by blood, but by soul. And it was that soul she now wanted to honor every day, planting not only fruit, but also dignity. The village in the distance changed too. They learned to respect that piece of land, as one would respect a temple. The shame of what they had done to Elsie remained like a collective scar. The village women began visiting the farm, some bringing bread, others asking for help. And for the first time, men previously dominated by ignorance began to see that a world without chains was possible. Caleb and Elsie didn't need to preach. They lived by example. One afternoon, as the sun tinted the sky orange and gold, Caleb called Elsie to his side and held her hand, now as strong as his. "The farm is yours, girl. It always has been. You freed more than yourself. You freed us all," he said, his voice breaking. Elsie wept, not from sadness, but from gratitude. She knew that the man who had saved her without asking for anything in return was now passing on to her the torch of a legacy that should never be extinguished, that of protecting those who don't know how to ask for help. And so, under the seemingly endless Texas sky, Elsie silently vowed to continue her work, that every life that crossed the farm gate would be welcomed, cared for, and respected, because freedom wasn't a place, but a state of mind. And in that dry, hard land, an invisible garden was born, watered with strength, courage, and love, a place where no one would ever again have to bow. And you, who listened to this story until the end, tell me, how many times in your life have you bowed to fear, to humiliation, to those who tried to break you? Perhaps you too carry invisible chains around your ankles, memories that hurt, wounds no one sees. But know that, just like Elsie, you can rise. You can rebuild your ground, your story, your outlook. Each of us has a Caleb inside our hearts, even if silent, that piece of strength that just needs to be awakened to say, "I will not bow." This story is about pain, yes, but above all, it's about redemption. About the power each of us has to transform not only our own destiny, but the destiny of those who cross our path. Caleb didn't use weapons. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply acted with firmness and truth. And perhaps that's what the world needs. Fewer speeches and more outstretched hands, more acceptance, more presence. The world needs more Calebs and more Elsies who know how to transform pain into freedom. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that life doesn't end with the chains you've been placed in. Subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, Facebook, wherever you can. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Maybe your story deserves to be told here too. Keep watching our videos. Each story here is a reminder that no matter how arid the earth, there's always a garden waiting to blossom. Thank you so much for listening this far. And remember, never bow down to those who try to extinguish your light, because as long as there's life, there's hope.